Welcome all of you to this session. We have had 3 sessions before. We had one session on digital media, then on print media, then on cinema, today film industry, and this session is going to be on race and caste in media. I am happy to have Dr. Santosh Chandrasekhar in this session, who can actually speak with a lot of authority on this subject. One of the issues which is rarely debated in the media today or in the academic circles is the issue of social background of the journalists and the media owners. Much of our discussions take place on media freedom, professional problems, and of course, political economy of the media, but we rarely focus on the issues of race and caste in media. In fact, any profession will work in the interest of everyone in the society only if it is representative. I remember Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar's speech on the last day of the Constitutional Assembly. That was his last speech. He said, democracy is a top dressing on a society which is essentially undemocratic. So democracy is not about elections and legislative processes, but it means there are democratic practices at all levels and democratic practices in all environments, whether it's media, whether it's industry, whether it is any kind of institution. And since media are supposed to be the fourth pillar of democracy, it is essential that the media themselves are democratic. So how representative is the media industry today in terms of the composition of people who work in media, in terms of people who own different media. If race is an issue in the United States, it is the caste which is an issue in India. And Santosh Chandrasekhar has seen both Indian and American media for the last two decades. And Santosh Chandrasekhar, has both professional as well as academic experience. He was working with the Hindu after he graduated from Bangalore University, and then later on moved to United States. He did his MS Communication at Bangalore University. Later, he moved to University of New Mexico in the United States. He did his MA there, and later he did his PhD in the same university in communication studies. Later, Santosh Chandrasekhar moved from University of New Mexico to University of Denmark in 2016 as assistant professor. He is right now working in University of Denmark as assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies. Santosh Chandrasekhar's interests, or Santosh Chandrasekhar's areas of interest, have been social movement, colonialism, the gender issues, and he has taught feminist methodology to the students, and he has written a lot of papers, and he has presented a lot of papers on issues related to race, religion, gender, and colonialism. And I think today we have a person who can speak on these issues with a lot of clarity. I am happy today Chandrasekhar has joined us from United States, although it is an odd hour for him to join. He must have lost his sleep already. I hope he will bear with us. I welcome Chandrasekhar and welcome all of you who are present in the Zoom meeting. Now I request Santosh Chandrasekhar to make his presentation. Santosh Chandrasekhar.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So hello everybody. Sir ಹೇಳಿತರ ನನ್ನ ಹೆಸರು ಸಂತೋಷ್ ಅಂತ. ಈಗಿಲ್ ರಾತ್ರಿ 3 ಗಂಟೆ, so please do excuse me. I did have my cup of coffee, so hopefully I'll be coherent. Um, so sir ಹೇಳಿತರ ನಾನು 2001 ನಲ್ಲಿ I got my MS in communication from Bangalore University. I was a professor of, I was a student of Professor B.A. Sridhara, who I want to remember at this point of time, because he was the one who really pushed me to go to the United States and pursue higher education. I worked as a journalist in Deccan Herald for 2 years and in the Hindu Bangalore bureau for 3 years. Before I moved to the United States. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk here today, although I might not take this up, a lot of my personal experience informs my analysis in terms of both how race structures the media, both in terms of its coverage of issues, but also in terms of its composition, and how caste occupies a very similar position. To also give another little bit background about myself, so I try to do this in pretty much every talk that I give. So nam tande Chandrasekhar anta, he had a ration depot. Nam tayi Rangamma anta, she was a government school teacher. So ನಮ್ಮ ತಾಯಿನೇ ನನ್ನ ಓದಿಸಿದ್ದು. She was very particular from a very young age that both I and my brother, we should study, because I was born in a Shudra community. And my parents, they were beneficiaries of the reservation policy. So ನಮ್ಮ ತಾಯಿ 10th ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಅವ್ರ ತಂದೆ ನಮ್ಮ ತಾತ, he made sure she took up a job as a teacher. But ಆಗ ಹೆಂಗಸರಿಗೆ ಅದೊಂದೇ ಆಪರ್ಚುನಿಟಿ ಅಲ್ವಾ. ಸೊ ಟೀಚರ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ it was considered a respectable profession. So he made sure she took up the job as a teacher, but at the same time, that was the only thing that was possible for her. So she was very particular that when I and my brother, when we were born, that we had access to education. So they were like, ನಮ್ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆಸ್ತಿ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಏನು ಮಾಡಕ್ಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಆದ್ರೆ ಏನ್ ಓದ್ತೀಯಾ ಅದಷ್ಟು ನಾವು ಓದಿಸ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಪದೇ ಪದೇ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ರು. So today I'm here partly because of the sacrifices of my parents and the reservation policy too. I believe I come from a community that's enumerated as 2A in Karnataka today. And generally reservation andre, there is a lot of opposition, and people feel that it rewards mediocrity. Atara, there is a thinking, and that's actually not true at all. And I'm also saying all of this because I work very closely with indigenous people in the United States. So one of the things that indigenous people have taught me is we should never forget where we come from. And we should never forget the kind of sacrifices that have made it possible for people to be where they are, because it's never about individual success. It's always about hundreds of people who make sacrifices that are never accounted for people to be in a position where they are. So that's in a nutshell about me. So my presentation is titled Race, Caste and Media. Predominantly this will be in English, but nang Kannada tumba chanag barutte, so yene prashne kannadalli idru keli parvagilla. I'm very happy to answer. I also have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll share the screen in just a second. I do notice that some people are zooming in without video access, and that's particularly, that's not a problem. I think a couple of slides you might want to have access to, but other than that, I think you should be able to follow my talk without having video input as well. So in terms of sort of the overview, the way I have structured this talk is I'll start talking about sort of the similarities as well as the differences in terms of race and caste. and their positionality within US media and Indian media respectively. So I want to start talking about the similarities and differences before we actually start thinking through how race is taken up in US media, as well as how caste is taken up in Indian media. And then I want to do a brief comparison and finally close my talk with a few observations on what stands out, and then open it up for question and answers. So that's sort of going to be a brief overview. So let me go ahead and give access to my slides. Yes?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, thank you. So again, I want to start this presentation with a quote by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. And as many of you already know, Babasaheb was in Columbia University, where he was very intrigued by the problems that were faced by Black people over there. And he was very convinced that the issues that were facing Black people were very similar to the issues that Dalits, or what we today call as the ex-untouchables in India, faced. So he got in touch with the Black intellectual, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's also considered one of the greatest sociologists in the United States, who studied the racial discrimination and racial violence facing Black people. So in his letter to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, asking for a copy of a report that the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So the NAACP wanted to present a petition to the United Nations. So Babasaheb writes to W.E.B. Du Bois asking for a copy of that petition to see how he could use it as a model to highlight the plight of Dalits. And therein, in that particular letter asking for a copy, he says there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of the Negroes in America, that the study of the latter is not only natural but unnecessary. So I want to start with this particular quote, because I think over here we can clearly see how Dr. Babasaheb clearly recognizes the parallels between racism, particularly anti-Blackness in the context of the United States, as well as the position of Dalits in India. And I think that comparison provides sort of the baseline for this entire paper, because I pursue that sort of an analysis in trying to understand how race has been taken up in American media, vis-a-vis how caste has been influential in Indian media. But before we actually do that, I want to take a quick minute to talk about some of the conceptual linkages between race and caste. So how they're similar as well as how they are different. So both race and caste are very arbitrary ways of stratifying populations into livable and expendable categories. So here I want to emphasize the word arbitrary. And basically what I mean by arbitrary is that there is absolutely no scientific or objective basis for the existence of racial categories or caste categories in the Indian context. So these are out and out human creations. There is no scientific basis whatsoever for either of them, but nevertheless, they are put into place. And once they are put into place, they have tremendous impact in terms of who lives and who has to provide service for people to live, right? So it basically splits human societies into two categories. One are the livable people who benefit from race in the US context, and who benefit from caste in the Indian context. And then there are categories who are rendered expendable. Expendable is basically people who can be forgotten. So their entire life is basically about serving the upper caste in the Indian context. It's basically serving whites in the US context. So it creates a division that's completely arbitrary in both societies. Caste precedes the creation of race in organizing society. So one thing that anthropologists agree on is that caste as a category has preceded the creation of race, because race is only 300 years old. And particularly now, the white black sort of binaristic conception of race is less than 150 years old. It was something that started with the development of slavery as a global institution, and particularly the development of eugenic science. Starting in the 1850s, and then of course the Nazis were sort of the exponents of eugenics, as we all know. So race is a comparatively recent creation. In 1400s, nobody had a concept of race. Europeans mostly understood the world in terms of Christians and non-Christians. So if you were either a Christian or you were not. People never really read societies in terms of skin color or in terms of physiological differences. That is something that starts happening more predominantly with the development of slavery in the last 300 years, and certainly becomes more intense in the last 150 years. Caste is associated with both Indian as well as Western societies. And this is something that's not necessarily discussed. So one of the earliest caste systems, I think Indian, Hindu society probably is the oldest institution that develops caste. But we also see Spaniards, for instance, in the 1400s, when they come to what we now call the New World, which is the Americas. They start taking over land. They start categorizing societies into octoroons, quadroons, so on and so forth. So you actually see the existence of what we call a casta system. But again, casta system then eventually develops into a racial system over a period of time. So caste is something that's associated with both Indian as well as Western societies, whereas race is sort of seen as exclusive to white societies. And we'll come back to this. I think the race caste conundrum is a little bit more complicated, because I think we also have very clear sort of racial boundaries in Indian society as well. And the last thing is that Indian caste system relies very heavily on religion for its basis, for its justification, whereas race relies equally on religion as well as on science. And I say that because race developed initially through sort of Christian conceptions of the world. So the world was divided into Christians, non-Christians, but then once people started noticing racial differences, they wanted to give it a very religious outlook. And so they started, looking into sort of biblical conceptions of the world. So you see that race uses both religion as well as science, whereas Indian caste system is heavily based on, of course, as we all know, religious scriptures. So Baba Saheb again does tremendous work in this particular area, both in who were the Shudras, as well as his book on Dalits. He talks about how the Hindu caste system emerges, or the Varna system emerges from the Rigveda, particularly Purusha Sukta. So the Virata Purusha, from his face comes the Brahmins, from his arms come the Kshatriyas. So Indian caste system very much then relies on religion much more than science for its justification. So quickly, now what is really similar about race and caste? One is, again, like I pointed out, divine will and the laws of nature. So we see that there is some sort of combination of both religion as well as science to justify both race as well as caste. And we are increasingly seeing this in the case of caste as well. For instance, there are publications, particularly genetic research, that people constantly draw upon to show that the upper castes are genetically linked to Europeans. that it was Aryans who actually invaded India and settled India, and there is a lot of genetic similarity between Europeans and the upper caste. And I think the most recent book that sort of makes this claim as well is Manu Joseph's Early Indians, which is out. So that's one example where you see that both race as well as caste sort of drop on both divine will as well as the laws of nature. The second part, this is really the most important part, is heritability. That both race as well as caste are herited characteristics. They are passed down by your parents. It's passed down through bloodlines. And once you get it, you're stuck with it for good. There is no escaping your race. The same way that there is no escaping of your caste. Endogamy and the control of marriage and mating is extremely important for both institutions. So again, I think Baba Saheb is really prescient here, because he talks about how endogamy is basically the other side of the coin of caste. That there is no caste without endogamy, and there is no endogamy without caste. The same thing happens in terms of race as well. So up until 1967, Virginia versus Loving, miscegenation or the ban on marriage or any sort of relationship between people of different races was prohibited in the United States. I think the last miscegenation law was actually scrapped in 2000. So you can see how much it has actually endured. So again, let me say that, right? The last law against miscegenation was scrapped in 2000, and I believe it was Alabama. So up until this very millennium, we have had laws on the books in the United States that prohibited marriage or any sort of relationship between two different races. We also see the notion of purity versus pollution. So the superior groups are always considered pure, the inferior groups are considered polluting. And so that is one way in which both race as well as caste is organized. So caste, we know that untouchability is because of notions of pollution. And we might say, well, that might not necessarily apply to race, but that is actually not true at all. So when the civil rights legislation was passed in the United States, and there was move to integrate schools, swimming pools, there is an incident that happened, I think it was in South Carolina, where a Black swimmer swam in a swimming pool that was used exclusively by white people. And after he swam in the pool, the people in the town were so disgusted that they actually had the entire pool drained out, washed, and refilled with water before white people could swim in it again. So you again see sort of ideas of purity and pollution in both places. There's an occupational hierarchy, which is also very much connected to especially caste, but also to race, where occupations or labor that is considered sort of beneath or dehumanizing is often done by the lower caste or by non-white people in the United States. We also see dehumanization and stigma, where the lower castes in India as well as non-white populations in the United States both face this phenomenon pretty equally across the board. Then we have terror as enforcement as well as cruelty as a means of control. So both caste boundaries as well as race boundaries are very astutely policed all the time. And if anybody tries to break the boundaries, then terror and cruelty is used as a way to put them back into place. And we see this both in terms of race as well as caste. I mean, the most easiest example of this in the context of the United States is cops killing Black people all the time is a good example of this. And even in India, we see this where constantly we see cases of like a Dalit student, for instance, passes a particular exam or gets good points, and then there is immediately some sort of backlash. So we see terror being used as a way to keep boundaries in place. And lastly, inherent superiority over inherent inferiority. So the key distinction, and I think Baba Saheb is really important here. So Baba Saheb says that inferiority or superiority does not attach to individual people, but it attaches to categories, right? So inferiority or superiority attaches to caste themselves or to races themselves. So it's not about whether individuals who are part of that particular caste or those races are inferior or superior, but rather those groups themselves are inferior or superior. So again, there is no way of escaping it. If you belong to that particular group, then you're either inferior or superior. That doesn't depend on who you are and the kind of work that you are done, but it depends on what group you belong to. So those are, again, some of the sort of commonalities that we see in terms of race, caste, and race and caste. So now I want us to think about race, caste, and media and how some of these issues are reflected across the board. So I want to think about first race and media before I go to caste and media, and I want to think about history, ownership, workforce, and representation to document some of these same characteristics that show when we think about particularly the media as a reflection of these dynamics. So thinking about race and media, and here I'm going to confine myself to the United States, which is where I live and work, but I think it's a really good sort of example of racial dynamics that you can generally see across white societies. You can see very similar characteristics in Europe. You can see very similar characteristics in Australia, in South Africa, in New Zealand, what are called as white societies. So you see very similar characteristics. So one thing that we see is that there is certainly a history of skewed representation, especially of Black people, but also of other groups such as Native Americans, Latinos, Asians, South Asians, and all of these particular groups. And I want to look at, and I want to draw your attention to two cartoons, which I often use in a lot of my work. On this side, you have a cartoon that I believe was published in the 1850s. In the 1870s, and this was the era of Jim Crow, when the North had won the Civil War and had abolished slavery, and the South was slowly developing Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was a system that was developed to make sure that Black people would not have access to any sort of power. So on the one you see on the right hand corner, this particular cartoon features a Black person with very exaggerated demon-like characteristics. So it's very evocative of the vampires, and the vampires are these demonic characters that evoke a lot of fear. They're also very anti-Christian and anti-biblical. So on the one hand, on the one wing you see Negro, and on the other wing you see rule. So basically these sorts of representations created the idea that if Black people were given access to power, then there would be complete anarchy in society, that everything would just fall apart. And this was used as a way to keep Black people at the bottom of society. So you see here how media actually participates in the perpetuation of stereotypes against groups of color. So if you look at the other cartoon, the cartoon in color, below you, and this was a cartoon that I believe was published in the early 1900s. So you have the state of Oregon itself depicted as a white male who has actually killed a number of Chinese people. So you see a number of dead Chinese people on his right side, and a number of them jumping into the Pacific Ocean on the left side. And below it says Hobson's choice: you can go or stay. And this is again part of the anti-immigration coverage on the media on the Western coast. And Asian migration to North America basically happened through the West Coast, whereas all other migrations to the US happened through the East Coast. So basically people crossed over from the Atlantic came to Ellis Island, came to New York, or to other parts of the East Coast, whereas Asian immigration basically happened through the West Coast. And here you see very clear sort of anti-Asian sentiment, particularly anti-Chinese sentiment, that this newspaper very clearly, without any sort of compunction, indulges in. So again, we see this sort of perpetuation of stereotypes, this sort of perpetuation of of racist sentiments against groups of color was a very regular feature in US media historically. So this is not a new phenomenon. It has endured over time. But then there's also a really rich tradition of marginalized groups trying to develop their own media to challenge stereotypes and hegemonic ideals. So on your right-hand side, you see a facsimile of the Chicago Defender. So the Chicago Defender was a Black-owned and Black-published newspaper that constantly drew attention to lynchings that that used to happen throughout the 1900s. And here is a case of a Black man who was lynched, and the story talks about what an injustice it is. So on the one hand, you had mainstream media, which very clearly was working to perpetuate stereotypes against people of color, but at the same time, you also have a really rich tradition, particularly in the Black community, much more than in any other community, of Black-owned newspapers, of Black journalists who were constantly calling attention to the injustices facing Black people. W.E.B. Du Bois himself was a prolific journalist, so he was a sociologist, but he was also a prolific journalist. Ida B. Wells was also a journalist. She was one of the people who started the Underground Railroad to get people out of slavery, but she was also a phenomenal journalist who covered lynchings that were happening in the Deep South for a number of northern newspapers. So there's a really rich tradition of communities of color, particularly the Black community, fighting against this sort of very racist representation. So in terms of ownership, mainstream media is overwhelmingly, as of course most of you know, overwhelmingly owned by white corporations. Here we can think about Fox News, which is the one that comes to mind right away. It's the largest news organization here in the United States. They are both vertically as well as horizontally integrated. And what I mean by that is that they have stake not only in print medium, but also in electronic medium, in digital media, right? They've conquered the news market horizontally, but they're also vertically integrated. So do a lot of other news organizations as well. NBC News, CNBC, so on and so forth. Most of the mainstream media is overwhelmingly owned by white corporations. They continue to perpetuate dominant ideologies. So although, and I'll come back to this in a second, but you still see that there is investment in keeping the racial status protected. Although there are some pressure to change the dynamic, but nevertheless, there is certainly a lot of investment in keeping the status quo. Media largely creates invisibility for racial issues. And I put the slash there because basically the media is very hesitant to talk about race, except when it suits them. So on the right-hand side, we have an ad that Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, took in 1989. There was a famous case where a white woman was jogging in New York. She was raped and killed, and 5 Black men were indicted for her murder, but they were later exonerated because it was found that they had not committed the rape or the murder. But nevertheless, Donald Trump took out this ad calling for death penalty for the 5 Black men. And it says, bring back the death penalty, bring back our police. So you basically, this was a full page ad, which was carried in the New York Times, which is in some way sort of equivalent to the Hindu in India. It's the newspaper of record. It's considered serious. It's not considered flippant. It's considered as a paper that's very respected, that's not given to sort of yellow journalism, but you actually see something as reputed as the New York Times run this particular ad. So you see how media creates invisibility, again, in/visibility. So it basically maintains a sort of silence on racial issues, but whenever it's convenient, it will certainly highlight them. The proliferation of digital media has been ambiguous, and I say ambiguous because on the one hand, I think it reflects dominant characteristics where the digital media is for the most part, again, owned by white corporations, but at the same time, you also see that groups are taking over online spaces and trying to create new mediums that try to reflect news in a very different way. And a great website that what I would draw your attention to is Black Agenda Report. Black Agenda Report is published by Black Leftists. It's a completely online site. It's open to everybody. There is no firewall. People can donate money if they want to, but nevertheless, that's a site where you see people cover issues in a very different way. So that's where I go to read about things when I can't find what I'm looking for in mainstream media. So you see that online spaces has opened up possibility for what I call media of color. So in terms of workforce, there's a continued domination of whites and men. Communities of color comprise 40% of the US population, but only 17% of the workforce, and 13% of media ownership. So predominantly, again, the workforce continues to be white, which my argument is that is one of the reasons why racial issues are not given the sort of space and the sort of coverage that they deserve, is because of how the ownership the workforce continues to be predominantly white. This rate worsens as one goes up the career ladder. So newsrooms are more mixed. When you look at entry-level positions, like when you're looking at copy editors, when you're looking at reporters, but once you start going up the ladder, it worsens. Women and women of color fare even worse when you take that particular category into account. So very few people of color, but even within that category, very few women of color who are hired in mainstream media organizations. And lastly, in terms of representations, so quickly to wind up this section, what we see in terms of media and race is that there is a lot of defensiveness and a lot of investment in whiteness. So whiteness continues to be the baseline. Whiteness continues to be the de facto normative position from which the media approaches things. There is an investment in diversity as against anti-racism. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want to do that. What I mean by this is that there is a sort of emphasis on diversity, or this idea that everybody is equal, rather than understanding how particular groups have been historically exploited. This also leads me to the third point. There is, despite some progress that has been achieved, color blindness is also massive and pervasive. And this again goes back to my comment about diversity, that the media doesn't want to see race. Basically, the idea is let's not really pay attention to race, with the presumption that not paying attention to race will somehow make racism disappear, which is not true at all. There's also an investment in liberal anti-racism, and we can talk more about this when we talk about caste. There is, however, growing visibility for people of color. And one side that I would use as a way to make this argument is Black Lives Matter. I think Black Lives Matter, if you actually look at how Black Lives Matter has been covered in the American media as well as in global media, you do start to notice that the US media now believes that it's really difficult to ignore the question of race in ways that it used to even a decade ago. So you do see some sort of growing visibility for people of color, and Black Lives Matter is a really great example of this. So now let's transition to caste in media. So we see similar kind of dynamics in India as well with regard to caste. So mainstream media mostly maintained a very studied silence over caste. So caste was never really a category of analysis outside of some very conservative sort of projects. Caste was never really taken up with any seriousness in Indian media. And this is especially glaring because, as Baba Saheb himself says, caste is the overarching category of Indian society. You cannot understand Indian society sociologically, politically, economically, spiritually, any which way if you ignore caste. But nevertheless, there is a studied silence around the question of caste. You also see that the media maintains the centrality of the upper caste. This is very much evident in the debates over the Hindu code bills that happened in the 1950s. You really see how the mainstream media basically put its weight around the centrality of the upper caste vision of what Indian society really looks like. Issues of inequality and casteist violence were really ignored except in very egregious cases. So the only time when caste really gets taken up in Indian media with any seriousness is when there is some sort of spectacular casteist violence where people die. Right, there are lynchings, there is a rape or things like that, and that seems to be the only time when Indian media will pay any attention to caste, particularly to the violence facing the Dalits. But other than that, caste is never really taken up for analysis. So also quickly, how am I doing on time?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to be really quick.
Yeah.
So as a quick way to show the sort of, again, point that I made previously, that mainstream media maintains the centrality of the upper caste, here is a cartoon that was published, I believe, in 1956, which is absolutely sort of derisive of Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism. So you see him leaving at midnight, sort of walking away, and this, of course, references his conversion to Buddhism. On the left side, you have, what apparently one can only presume as being his wife and his child. This, of course, is a reference to the sort of common understanding of Buddha as somebody who left his home in the middle of the night in terms of enlightenment. And this is especially glaring because Baba Saheb, in his book Buddha and his Dhamma, very clearly sort of refutes this entire story and says that is not how the Buddha went out. It was not in search of some sort of transcendental enlightenment, but it was rather because of the social injustice that he saw in society. But nevertheless, you see the cartoon, the way in which he depicts him very derisively. So this is again a very sort of a very emblematic of example of how the mainstream media is very clearly sort of invested in the centrality of the upper caste. In terms of ownership, again, we see the very similar patterns in terms of what I discussed in terms of race and media in the United States. Mainstream media ownership is resolutely in the hand of elites who are predominantly from higher caste. So again, you can look at the media organizations in India today. You can look at Indian Express. You can look at the Hindu, and I'll particularly talk about the Hindu because I worked in the Hindu for 3 years. It is owned by the Hindu Group. It is run by the Hindu Group, which is basically a family-owned trust, right? So that is one example where you see mainstream media being predominantly owned by higher caste. Although Dalit media has existed, and again, here we can think about the parallels with Black media in the United States. And Mook Nayak is a great example. Mook Nayak is a paper for which Dr. Ambedkar wrote pretty frequently. They have not had the same sort of robust presence in the way that Black media developed in the United States. And we can talk about that. We can talk about why that's the case in a second. We also have certain publications that were owned by elite OBCs. So for instance, Deccan Herald and Prajavani was owned by a group that was historically categorized as OBC. And they did flourish, but again, for the most part, mainstream media is very much owned by upper caste. And online spaces have certainly opened up new possibilities. Now, workforce is where I really want to sort of spend some time. So journalists in the mainstream media are predominantly drawn from the upper caste. And the recent numbers that I've been able to access says that although upper caste constitute only 24% of the Indian population, they are 88% of journalists or media professionals. So that's a really glaring number. If you go back to the previous number that we talked about in terms of race and media, you see that this is a really stark number, that Indian media workforce is predominantly comprised of upper caste, which means that Dalit Bahujan journalists are few and far in between. Vernacular media has much better representation of Dalits and OBCs compared to English media, but it is definitely not proportional at all in any way. It still lags behind, but it's slightly better compared to English media, and print media again has better representation over electronic media in terms of workforce. So workforce is something that I'll return to in just a second, but this is a huge glaring lag that we cannot ignore. In terms of representation, again, the endurance of caste system in Indian context, I believe, is to a great extent because of the complicity of the media. So here again, my argument is that the mainstream media maintains a studied silence towards caste, except as part of electoral configurations. So whenever there are elections, you see the media constantly make caste-wise calculations. And it looks like that's about the only time that caste actually appears in media's calculations. Other than that, there is a studied silence, and there is a studied silence, particularly when it comes to caste injustice, which is a major blind spot. So to give you just one example, according to the National Crime Bureau, crimes against Dalits rose 25% between 2006 and 2016. So in that 10-year period, crimes against Dalits rose by 25%, but you barely see any corresponding increase in coverage. So coverage has been lagging at the same rate. So again, this goes back to the comment that I made earlier, that the only time that caste, particularly casteist violence, seem to appear as a topic of conversation in media is when there is some sort of eruption of spectacular violence. Other than that, casteist injustice and casteist violence is often ignored by the media. And lastly, you do see some sort of anti-casteism developing in Indian media, but it's mostly liberal anti-casteism. And what I mean by liberal anti-casteism is a particular approach which tries to challenge casteism as an individual behavior rather than a systematic phenomenon. So it doesn't fight the systems that create casteist violence, casteist injustice in the first place, but rather it only tries to fight the effects. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A as well. But nevertheless, I do see that, and I think a great example of that is right now. I'm sure all of you have been noticing the riots that happened in Bangalore, where the house of a Dalit MLA was attacked. And the way in which both the parties are fighting about who gets to represent Dalits, and the way that the media is actually covering it very uncritically without asking questions about the centrality of casteist violence in India, I think is a great example of that phenomenon. So in comparison, both race and caste continue to be contentious issues in mainstream US and Indian media. you see this, and people might think somehow US media is better, and in some ways it is, but there is definitely lingering issues where race is a blind spot there, and caste is certainly a blind spot in Indian media. The media tends to be dominated by whites in the in the US context, and high caste in the Indian context. But while racial injustice has garnered worldwide attention, including better media representation, I think caste injustice definitely continues to be ignored, and it certainly is not on the same footing as the sort of attention that racial injustice has received in the United States. Now, why is this the case? I think is the question we need to ask, and I want to provide a couple of thoughts by way of conclusion. So my basic understanding in terms of why caste injustice remains a blind spot in Indian media is because of how caste representation is directly proportional to the recruitment of Dalit Bahujan journalists in India. So the argument I want to make, and generally we start our presentations with the argument, but I'm sort of saving it to the end. The argument of my entire presentation is to say that caste will not appear as a topic worthy of attention or as a central topic for Indian mainstream media as long as there is low recruitment of Dalit Bahujan journalists. So the attention paid to caste is directly proportional to the number of Dalit Bahujan journalists who are consciously recruited by mainstream media. We do need policies that mandate or at least encourage that sort of recruitment. So what I'm saying is, again, I think Dr. Purnananda has mentioned this as well. I think it's very important to understand that in India, most of the media that we are talking about are privately owned. So they are not under any sort of mandate to recruit Dalit or Bahujan journalists. So they either have to do that consciously as some sort of like social responsibility drive, or they have to do it in a way that the state mandates them to do it. And since the state is not going to do that, I think it's entirely up to private media organizations to do it on their own. And very few media organizations will ever really think about consciously recruiting Dalits or Bahujan journalists as part of their workforce. And until that happens, I think the caste will continue to be a blind spot in Indian media. I also think that there needs to be investment in Dalit Bahujan media. And I think online spaces are a great place to actually incubate that sort of media. Again, I would recommend roundtableindia.in as a really great site that is Dalit owned, Dalit operated, that does a lot of this work. So I think that sort of spaces need to be very consciously cultivated, and without that sort of cultivation, I don't think it's going to work out in terms of reflecting casteist violence in the media. And I think certainly following the lead of African American activism can open new possibilities, where one of the things that African American groups are doing in the United States is that they are making demands on mainstream media to cover issues of racial injustice, while they're also starting their own media. And now we have an entire phenomenon called Black Twitter, which is Twitter sort of like taken over by Black people that talks about racial injustice. So I think we need both of those sort of strategies, where we demand mainstream media recruit more Dalit and Bahujan journalists, but at the same time, there is also a need to start Dalit Bahujan media that can pay special attention to caste. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for making a very insightful and informative presentation. Again, I would not like to, try to summarize what you have said. They have heard you from the beginning. There are a couple of questions which you may try to answer. There is one question from Parinita from St. Joseph College, Bangalore. her question is this: what are the dominant narratives around the coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement in the American media?
My understanding of the dominant narrative is basically, again, sort of going back to the liberal anti-racism. It's to say that the violence that cops are indulging in is an individual phenomenon. So it's basically a few bad cops rather than policing itself as a system that is anti-Black. So that is one of the narrative that you see over and over across mainstream media, of course. And again, if you lean more rightwards, if you look at Fox News, the narrative is entirely different. It's about how Black people are looting, how Black people are, sort of like completely out of control, and so they need to be reined in. But in terms of mainstream media, what we would call centrist media, I think the narrative is there is some admission of racial injustice, but I think there is a complete sort of underemphasis on the extent to which racial injustice is historically structured in the United States. So there is absolutely like no conception around that at all. And the idea is that policing as an institution is not the problem. Individual bad cops are. But one of the things that I think Black intellectuals have very clearly demonstrated is that policing as an institution itself is a problem, because policing in the United States actually develops out of slave patrols that were put together to go after runaway slaves, to capture them. So that is actually the sort of origins of policing one of the roots of modern policing in the United States is slave patrols. So it's not that individual cops are a problem, but it's the entire institution of policing itself which is a problem. So that's one of the narrative that we see.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. It's written in Kannada. Shall I read out?
Yes, sir. Kandita.
Yeah. ಇವತ್ತು ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು, ಮಂಡ್ಯ, ಮೈಸೂರಿನಂತೆ ಊರುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾತಿವಾರು ಬಡಾವಣೆಗಳು, ಖಾನಾವಳಿಗಳು, ಹೋಟೆಲ್ಗಳು ವಿಜೃಂಭಿಸುತ್ತಿವೆ. ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ದಲಿತರ ಮೇಲಿನ ದೌರ್ಜನ್ಯ, ಅತ್ಯಾಚಾರಗಳು ಸುದ್ದಿಯಾಗುವುದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಎಂಬಷ್ಟು ಕಡಿಮೆ ಇರುವಾಗ ಮಾಧ್ಯಮಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ದಲಿತ ಮಾಲೀಕತ್ವದಿಂದ ಇವುಗಳನ್ನು ನಿರೀಕ್ಷಿಸಬಹುದೇ? ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬರ ಕನಸು ಸಾಕಾರಗೊಳಿಸಲು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಸಲಹೆ ಏನು? You actually did talk about ownership of newspapers by backward communities and Dalit communities. But if you would like to add something, for those who don't understand Kannada, this is a question about what about the ownership of media by Dalits and OBCs?
So I'll answer in Kannada as well as in English. So
Kandita, most of our, there are a lot of students who don't understand Kannada.
That's why I'll do both. So ಜಾತೀಯತೆ ಬರೀ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು, ಮಂಡ್ಯ, ಮೈಸೂರಿಗೆ ಸೀಮಿತ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಅಮೆರಿಕದಲ್ಲೂ ಖಂಡಿತ ಇದೆ. ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಅವರು ಹಾಗೇನೆ ಬರೆದ್ರು, ವೇರೆವರ್ ಹಿಂದೂಸ್ ವಿಲ್ ಗೋ ದೇ ವಿಲ್ ಟೇಕ್ ಕ್ಯಾಸ್ಟ್ ವಿತ್ ದೆಮ್ ಅಂತ. ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲೂ ಐ ವಾಸ್ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಸರ್ಪ್ರೈಸ್. ಒಂದ್ ತಿಂಗಳ ಮುಂಚೆ ಐ ವಾಸ್ ಅಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಸ್ಟೋರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ದಿನಸಿ ತಗೊಳಕಂತ ಹೋಗಿದ್ದೆ. ಸೊ ಐ ಸಾ ಕಾಫಿ, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಿನ್ಸ್ ಕಾಫಿ. It's an instant coffee. So ಜಾತೀಯತೆ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಕಡೆ ಇದೆ. ದಲಿತರು ಖಂಡಿತ they have to own media. So ದಲಿತ ಮಾಲೀಕತ್ವ ಕಂಪಲ್ಸರಿಲಿ ಬೇಕೇ ಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಅದು ಒಂದು ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ಮೀಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಈ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ಪರಿಹಾರ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಟ್ ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಡಿಸ್ಪೆನ್ಸಿಬಲ್ ಕಂಡೀಷನ್. ಆ ದಲಿತರ ಮಾಲೀಕತ್ವ ಬೇಕೇ ಬೇಕು ಮಾಧ್ಯಮದ ಪ್ರಕಾರ. ಅಂಡ್ ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲ್ ಸೋರ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಂಟೆನ್ಷನ್. So again, going back, my answer is yes, we need Dalit ownership of media if we have to reflect questions of caste injustice in the media. And some people might say that really has nothing to do with who owns the media, but rather it's about the sort of politics that owners should have. To some extent, that's true. But I also do believe that only he who wears the shoe knows where it pinches. ರೈಟ್. ಅದ್ಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ಯಾರು ಜಾತಿಯ ಈ ವೈಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಯಾರು ಅದನ್ನ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿರ್ತಾರೋ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತು ಅದರ ಅದರ ನೋವೇನು ಅಂತ. ಅದರಿಂದನೇ ದಲಿತರ ಮಾಲೀಕತ್ವ ಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಈ ಈ ಈ ಜಾತಿಯ ಒಂದು ಈ ವಿಷ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗೋ ತರ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. ಅದರಿಂದ ದಲಿತರ ಮಾಲೀಕತ್ವ ಬೇಕು. ಸೊ ವಿ ನೀಡ್ ownership of Dalits in media or Dalit media, because I think it's very important that people who really know what it means to be on the receiving end of casteist injustice are in charge of media. And that is the reason I would say, yes, politics matters, but it also matters that people who have the best sort of personal experience about this phenomenon are also put in places of responsibility.
Thank you, Santosh. This was actually a question from Rupa K. from Siddhartha Media Center in Tumkuru. I thank her for this question. We'll have one more question from Muthu UT, who is a research scholar in Department of Journalism and Science Communication, Madurai Kamaraj University. The question is, how does caste play out in India's newsrooms? You have touched upon it, but if you want to add that.
Certainly, like I said, 88%, that is I think that survey came out in 2016, and I've not seen the numbers after that. And the reason is that we don't really hold caste-based surveys in India. So the numbers are very hard to come by. Most of these are voluntary reporting by people. So what we really know is that newsrooms are basically have predominant upper caste representation, and very few OBC Dalits, particularly very, very few Dalit journalists. So the newsroom itself becomes a very hostile space. And the newsroom is really important because it's the newsroom that decides which issues are highlighted in the media. I think in classic sort of mass communication theory, we call this agenda setting. So it's the media that decides which issues are going to be debated by society, and it's the newsroom that decides which issues are going to be highlighted in the media. And if the newsrooms are themselves dominated by upper caste, then I think it's very reasonable to say that issues of casteist injustice are not going to be represented in the newsrooms. And again, I'll use my own example. When I was working as a journalist for the Hindu, we would meet at the press club in Cubbon Park. Purna sir knows this. We would meet at the press club in Cubbon Park pretty frequently. And one of the jokes among journalists was that they would call the Hindu Agraharam, because of how it was completely sort of dominated by upper caste. So that is again one example, that if the newsroom itself is dominated by upper caste, then I think it's very reasonable to say that issues of caste injustice are not going to be going to receive the same sort of attention that they should.
I think there is a similar question by Simon Varghese, National School of Journalism, Bangalore. What do you think would be way to open up newsrooms for lower caste groups? Do you think this would change the way events are written about? I think.
Yeah, I think it is very important that new media organizations set policies. I think the Editors Guild of India might actually be a group that can mandate that media organizations set a sort of policy where the sort of proportional representation of Dalit OBC groups are mandated as part of the organization's recruitment policy. So there is one way to go. I think certain media organizations have taken it upon themselves to do that. I do know that the Hindu is sort of making a very conscious effort to recruit Dalit OBC people, to recruit Muslim journalists, and so on and so forth. But most media organizations don't. So I think it has to be mandated by professional media bodies, where media organizations are very clearly told that a certain percentage, and that's the bare minimum, right? But a certain percentage of their journalist workforce has to be recruited from Dalit OBC networks. And I do think that that sort of policy might not necessarily produce results like tomorrow or even in like the next year, but I think it builds up where you will sort of see that there is more issues paid to castes, injustice in Indian society. So I do think, and how do we know this? We know this because of African-American activism in the United States. I think today, if Black Lives Matter has managed to gather the sort of attention of the entire world, has managed to gather the attention of people in the United States, it is because of years of activism by the Black community, where one of the key demands was that media pay adequate attention to issues of representation, but also issues of who was journalists. Who was the journalist who was covering issues? And so that this sort of two-pronged strategy where the workforce needs to be very consciously recruited, but also the issues needs to be presented from the perspective of the oppressed group. I think we know for sure that it pays results over a period of time. So I think making that mandatory in certain way, or making that sort of like a prescription by professional bodies, might be the way to go in India.
Okay, there is one more question from Srinivasa Vijitaya. His question is this: caste class versus merit is the big discussion, especially in the media and academics in India. What is the scenario in the US context? Caste class versus merit.
It certainly exists. I don't think it exists in the same way, but again, as a lot of you already know, US has affirmative action policies. The one difference between the reservation policies in India and affirmative action policies in the United States is that a lot of the benefits that are quote unquote extended to people of color in the United States is not necessarily based on meeting certain quotas, although that is also part of, for instance, if you apply for federal grants and if you're a subcontractor, then a certain part of your workforce has to be minority. So that includes women, that includes African Americans, that includes people of color. So you see that sort of thing. There is a heartburn among the white majority that sort of policy needs to mediocrity, but I don't think it circulates in the same way as it does in India. And I think part of the reason why that is the case is that in India, this sort of tensions around reservations has simmered for the last 70 years, and now the state has openly sort of provided the outlet for it. The state, and now I think we can talk about the reservation that the current government has extended for economically disadvantaged groups as part of the reservation policy, and I think that is very much aimed towards that sort of denying reservations for OBCs and Dalits. And so it is certainly there, but I don't think it is there to the same extent, because the other thing too is I think only in the last 2 decades, most Indians have been able to find employment in the private sector. In the last 5 decades, I think at least the first 5 decades after our independence, it was the state that was the biggest employer. Whereas in the United States, I think that is another really important thing. Most of the people do not have state jobs. They're employed by the private sector, and the private sector gets a little sort of slippery when it comes to affirmative action policies. Some of them have to implement it, others don't have to. So I don't think there is the same sort of backlash, but it is certainly there.
There is actually one question. What I understand from this question is that is something on caste and race in cinema. It's too broad a question. Yeah. So generally, if you want to make a few statements on this.
On race and caste in cinema?
Yeah.
caste, I don't think is again appeared as an analytical category in Indian cinema. I think it did for a minute in the 1970s and the 1980s as part of new wave cinema. I think there were efforts to talk about caste, but caste often got rolled into sort of like rural issues or issues facing rural India rather than as a phenomenon that appears everywhere. I think now there is certainly some attention being paid to caste, but it's completely liberal anti-casteism. I think Article 15 is a great example of this. I'm sure a lot of people have watched that movie. And my understanding, reading a commentary by Dalit intellectuals, is that it's a really atrocious treatment of caste. Because it again sort of uses an upper caste hero as the savior at the end of the day, and it is completely blind to casteist violence from the perspective of Dalits or from the perspective of like people who are the most oppressed by caste. So I think caste is certainly a blind spot by Indian cinema. However, I do see certain attempts that are really trying to break the mold. So I think Paranjit's work, I think, is a great example of how caste is being taken up. And again, here, I think we constantly sort of forget that vernacular media is actually like does a much better job. Again, I'm nowhere saying vernacular media is where it should be. There is still a huge sort of blindness, but I think vernacular media, including film, what we call as regional films in India, I think are doing a much better job compared to Bollywood in terms of taking the caste question. But there is this entire other phenomenon that we also need to talk about. For instance, movies like Bahubali, the way they reinforce the Varna system is pretty staggering. The sort of the heroification of the Kshatriyas. But there are no Kshatriyas in South India. If you actually look at the Varna theory, there is no Kshatriyas in South India. But nonetheless, the way that it sort of lionizes Kshatriyas, the way in which it lionizes the Varna system. So there is an entire conversation that needs to be had in terms of how mainstream movies continue to reinforce the caste system. In terms of race, I think, again, here we need to look at the sort of movies that are coming from African-American filmmakers and the way they are presenting race. So Jordan Peele, I think, is a great example. His movies really do a much better job in terms of approaching racial violence than what Hollywood does. So again, that's where I keep on going back to my central argument in this presentation, that whatever, it doesn't matter whether it's news media, whether it's print media, electronic media, digital media, films, it has to be Dalit owned. It has to be a Dalit OBC effort. And then you actually see how the issues that are presented are very different and presented from a very different perspective.
Okay, this was a question from Juliana Victor, assistant professor in the Department of Communication, Media, Auxilium College from Gandhinagar, Vellore. There's one more question here. This is from Roorkee Chand. He is saying the mainstream media of India prioritize coverage based on region and their people, not basically based on the value of the news and its national importance. So what is your opinion? Probably he's meaning that, they are paying attention to a lot of issues of national importance.
I don't know who decides national importance, because I think we sort of take it for granted that there is some agreement around what counts as national importance. I don't necessarily think that is the case, but I think what I can safely say is what is often considered as important by mainstream media are mostly issues that are considered important by the upper caste. So for instance, you can see particular issues that are highlighted. For example, I think this is really one of the best examples that we can think about, the plight of migrant workers. when the lockdown happened in India, and how it was basically ignored in mainstream media. I mean, there were some human interest stories, but that was it. And this was one of the biggest sort of halt downs in human history, shutting down over 100 crore people. Right? A majority of them poor, a majority of them with no means of livelihood. And the way in which the media could actually ignore this massive human crisis and sort of present this as a great move that helped India control COVID cases, I think then demonstrates what do we mean when we even talk about national importance. I think this is very much dependent on the caste class group that you are a part of. And in India, it's the upper caste class group that determines what counts as nationally important.
Yeah. There is a question from William Marcel from St. Aloysius College, Mangalore. His question is this: what has been the contribution of Indian academia and education system in making students conscious of casteism and racism in media?
I don't know if you're asking about Indian academia in the United States, but I'm going to approach that question from that particular perspective. There has not been much contribution, and this is also partly the latest numbers that I saw was from 2019, which says that over 90% of the Hindu diaspora in North America, and I'm including both Canada as well as United States, is predominantly Savarna or upper caste. So, and it's predominantly drawn from this particular group, which then means that, again, the same issue. If you are going to have a group that has no personal or academic understanding of casteism, then there is no investment for them to highlight it in their work, in their scholarship, in their teaching. And so caste as well as race in the Indian context continues to be a very under-researched area as far as United States academia is concerned. That is slowly changing, though. I think there is a new group of both upper caste as well as Dalit OBC academics who are trying to draw attention to caste race in the Indian context. But in the last 5 decades, those efforts have been very far and few in between.
Thank you. There is a question from Abhishek Suman from St. Joseph College, Bangalore. His question is, what is your take on media coverage of Northeastern tribes? What I have observed is it has changed from marginalization to stereotypes.
Definitely. Again, that goes back to the point that I've been making over and over, that the sort of normative position from which Indian mainstream media approaches everything continues to be upper caste. And in sort of the upper caste conception of India or Bharat as we know it, Northeast is sort of on the outer rim. So they are a part, but they're not necessarily culturally a part of India. And I think I would completely agree that it has changed from indifference to stereotypes. There is a pushback against that. I do know that Northeastern groups constantly organize and try to write editorials. They try to challenge the sort of stereotyping of people from the Northeast. But nevertheless, as far as mainstream media is concerned, I think there is a complete ignorance in terms of the history of India, in terms of the place of the Northeast in the Indian imagination, as both, again, as Northeast scholars themselves call it, as both sort of like racially and religiously different from the rest of India. And I think both of those have contributed to the stereotypes that get to be invoked against the people of Northeast.
Oh, thank you. Although there are more questions, we'll end with one more question.
Sure.
From Sharat Lal. He is drawing a parallel between LGBT and the caste. And he's saying that these sexual minorities too are not represented in media. What is your take on this?
I would say the parallels with African Americans is a much better comparison, and I say that partly because I think Dalits themselves have sort of stepped in that direction, and Dalit themselves constantly call attention to how their place in the caste hierarchy in India is very similar to the place of Black people in the racial hierarchy in the United States. So it's not something that it's not an academic argument, but I'm taking the lead of Dalits themselves who note that a better comparison is African Americans. I think the issue of LGBTQ is really complicated, partly because at least in English media, there is some representation of LGBTQ people. I wouldn't say again it's ethical. I wouldn't say that it tries to reflect the issues facing them in all the complexity, but nonetheless, I think there is at least some sort of awareness in the English media. And my argument here also draws upon how, so there is an entire field in US academia around gender and sexuality studies. And then there is critical gender and sexuality studies. And one of the arguments that critical gender and sexuality studies scholars make is that gender and sexuality become admissible categories in a way that actually prevents or that actually facilitates the exclusion of historically marginalized groups. So when we talk about, and this is where I think one of the arguments that I made when I was talking about race and media was that there is an investment in diversity rather than anti-racism. And what I mean by diversity is that, again, LGBTQ issues are given proportionately more representation, particularly when it affects white gay people or white queer people. So again, even there you see how it's not so much only about LGBTQ issues, but it's about who are the LGBTQ people that we are talking about. And I think very recently I saw an article in Indian media about a prince who came out as gay, and I think he is part of a royal family somewhere in North India. And that was used as a way to talk about the continued invisibility of queer people in India. But I think the interesting part, which the article does not talk about, is the caste angle. So I think in some ways, yes, LGBTQ issues continue to be a blind spot in Indian media, but I think there are ways in which they appear in this sort of very liberal, diversity-oriented way rather than in a structural sort of way.
Okay, thank you, Santosh, for sparing your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
An overview of issues related to race and caste in media. I'm sure students, research scholars, and teachers who have been listening to you have got a lot of new ideas to think about, matters related to caste, race, and media. And this is actually the last, session of this webinar. This is the fourth and the last. And I also thank all those, who have been participating in the webinar for the last 2 days. They have asked very interesting questions. They have participated in the discussion. And I also thank my, colleagues here, my colleague, Dr. Varghese, who is the chairman of the department, Satish Kumar, associate professor here, and Satya Prakash, who is an assistant professor here. All of them took a lot of initiative and interest in organizing this webinar. I'm thankful to everybody. I thank all the research scholars in the department who actually helped us technically in arranging this webinar. So thank you, one and all. Thank you, Santosh.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed being able to share some thoughts with everybody.
Yeah.